back to World War Now, everybody. I'm your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalygin. This is our 93rd episode of World War III analysis here with a big show discussing impending strikes from both Israel and Iran, as both sides have vowed to retaliate in some capacity to recent escalations. We're going to be talking about recent words from the Saudis about their situation and perspective on the Palestinians and relations with Iran. We're going to be talking about news and disputes about the potentiality of North Korean troops entering Kursk and entering Ukraine proper. We're going to be talking about the upcoming U.S. election. This is going to be our last episode before you know who, well, maybe not who knows, depending on how long the counting takes and the steal takes, but this will be the last World War Now episode you listen to before the U.S. election, the U.S. 2024 presidential election between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. So we're obviously going to be discussing that. We're going to be discussing the situation in Georgia, obviously the attempted color revolution in the midst of the recent elections for the Georgian Dream Party. We're going to be talking about obviously other frontline updates in Ukraine, the situation in Lebanon, as well as a whole host of other World War III issues. Be sure to click the link down below, worldwarnow.co, to get every episode like this in your inbox the moment that it drops. So again, and you support us obviously by getting behind that paywall on Substack as well if you want to support the show and get access to all of our Ether Hour episodes as well, which is our secondary show. But it's time to dive into this World War III analysis. Dmitry, how are you doing?
Doing great, Conrad. Good to be here with you. And hello to all of our dear listeners. Thank you for all the supporters as well. It's been a busy 2024 and we are moving into perhaps the most crucial stage of the year. It's exactly, we're almost reaching that 3-year mark of the SMO, just over a year after the beginning of the Palestinian-Israeli hot war. And now, of course, this is the most crucial phase because we are, as you said, less than 1 week before the election in the US, and world affairs may either escalate or they will increase drastically in terms of exactly what takes place around the world based on who wins the US election. Unfortunately, the most powerful economy in the world, the most powerful military force does impact exactly what takes place in various other countries and states. And I think the entire world is watching the United States as to what will happen this Tuesday and Wednesday of this coming week. So I think we're all kind of awaiting and very cautious. And I think world affairs, essentially, even this week, I think the news really reflects that because nothing really drastic has taken place, but a lot of very strong rhetoric was thrown around, especially by the Iranians and the Israelis. I think in particular, Iran has found it incredibly crucial to push back against Israel, rhetorically stating that they can hit very key targets of Israel with their long-range ballistic missiles, and very open and I suppose very transparent nuclear rhetoric was also exchanged. They've stated that their nuclear program is built up to such a level that they could actually produce nuclear weaponry, nuclear bombs, and they have the method of delivery, which most likely they could attach a nuclear warhead to one of their new ballistic sort of hypersonic missiles and of course shoot them cross-continentally. But in this case, it wouldn't even need to fly across the continent. In fact, it would just need to fly a few hundred kilometers over into Israel, which is, I think, a very direct threat to Israel's existence. In a way, Conrad, it does play into the major rhetoric of J.D. Vance, who we recently saw on the Joe Rogan podcast, and Donald Trump, who have kind of painted Iran as this main enemy of democracy and liberalism in the Middle East, in particular the head enemy of Israel, who is the so-called greatest ally of the liberal and, I suppose, the enlightened West, unfortunately, with the United States at its helm. So I think this is a really big issue. Iran is not afraid to throw around this nuclear rhetoric that it could potentially destroy Israel and wipe it off the face of the earth. This is very much playing into that Republican, rhino, neocon talking point that we kind of were aware of and we've kind of reported on for the last year and a half because it's incredibly dangerous. We do see some major things shifting around in world politics, in particular, Russia, of course, escalating its support for both Iran and North Korea. And again, Iran predisposed in order to strike back at Israel in the next coming few weeks, I think. I don't think Iran's going to wait, similar, remember, to their delayed strike before, where it took exactly 3 or 4 weeks for them to strike back at Israel, and the same for Israel here. I think, in fact, if we see Iran strike Israel in this next week, aligning with the US election, we're going to be caught in in fact, it may even impact the election itself, Conrad, and what kind of rhetoric we'll see in, for example, Trump's victory speech, if he does win, or even Kamala's victory speech. And generally speaking, the entire Middle Eastern situation is very much bound up with the US election, which I think is very unfortunate because, again, the Middle East should have its own independent, sovereign-based policies. Even Israel should be looking out for its own affairs and not really controlling and, mind controlling, essentially, you can say, and controlling the United States through its internal lobbies. And I think the unfortunate factor is, as we'll see, countries like Syria, US positioning of its troops, both in the Persian Gulf and in the Red Sea, as well as US bases in Iraq and eastern Syria, it shows you that the US is very much still meddling in Middle Eastern politics. It hasn't left. All this Trumpist rhetoric that Trump has stopped all wars and the US has left the Middle East is, I think, all false. In fact, the US is very much back in the Middle East, and I think we will see a potential escalation to a hot war very soon, possibly just after the election, which I think reflects why Iran is potentially trying to deter the US and Israel from any further strikes by stating that they are willing to make a nuclear weapon project happen. And I think in a way that may actually bite back at Iran, because it may provoke Israel to strike further at perhaps Iran's nuclear facilities, which we've spoken about. This is one of the sort of key issues going into the future, and potentially even may provoke a even further escalation. For example, a US strike against Iran directly, which we noticed during the last Donald Trump presidency. That was almost always the threat, is that the US may in fact send its Predator drones, send its Air Force in order to strike against Iran. That's what people feared. And I think this is a real fear going into this next potential Trump presidency in 2024.
I very much agree. And I think stay tuned. Obviously, we're going to get into our predictions and just raw analysis of just the election in the US and what we think is going to happen. But we have to discuss some of the things obviously going on in Israel between Iran and Syria and the Zionists themselves in Lebanon and Iraq. And the big news right now is that Israel is bracing for an attack from Iran that they claim will be launched from Iraq. They claim it might be launched from Iran and Iraq, but that it will be primarily, or rather that Iran will primarily be utilizing its Iraqi proxies. This is from antiwar.com. Israeli sources told Axios on Thursday that Israeli intelligence suggests Iran is preparing to launch a reprisal attack on Israel from Iraqi territory in the coming days, and that it could happen before the November 5th U.S. presidential election. The Israeli sources said the Iranian attack could involve a large number of drones being fired from Iraq. They said launching it from Iraq through Iranian-allied Shia militias could be an attempt to avoid another round of Israeli airstrikes on Iranian territory. Of course, the Iranians have claimed that their actual retaliation for this is going to be stronger than the October 1st strikes. So perhaps this is, the Israelis trying to suggest to the Iranians that if they did this, they'd be able to back off. But at the same time, the Israelis have openly said that they are going to retaliate. I don't know if this means against Iran or if against Hezbollah only in Lebanon, but that they need to retaliate for the strike on Netanyahu's house in Caesarea. So obviously we know that no one actually was killed, but there was some substantial damage done to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's home. And I think that obviously that was a message being sent, and the Israelis are trying to retaliate for that. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei himself has apparently ordered, according to the New York Times, the IRGC to strike Israel. I think it's clear that him, at least, and the hardliners within Iran, that they are trying to reestablish themselves on the front foot when it comes to this escalation. For a while, again, right before the October 1st strike, I was blackpilling. I was saying that Iran, they're a bunch of cowards. They're not doing anything. I was like, it's just Jover. And then, of course, they kind of regained a bit of respect after the strikes. And now I think they're trying to keep that momentum to where, again, they want to be a bit in control of the escalation game, because Israel, if it wasn't for that strike, they were about to have basically proven to the world they can get away with anything, destroying Iranian embassies, striking Iranian territory, killing, major Iranian figures, killing people in the capital in the midst of inaugurations and these sorts of things. But Iran has, I'll admit, they have somewhat succeeded in reinforcing their deterrence and their ability to respond adequately and, I guess, strategically as well. They've managed to thread this needle in some capacity, because obviously the U.S. is, especially as the election is getting closer, at least, I think certain forces within the U.S. right now are obviously trying to hold back, this escalation. And everybody, the same thing in Ukraine, as you mentioned, Dimitri, the same thing in Iran and Lebanon, and even in China and Taiwan. All these people, all the powers involved, everybody on both sides, the proxy and the multipolar power and everybody in between, they're, waiting for bated breath to see how this election goes, which is interesting. Of course, everybody has to, they have contingency plans built for whoever wins and everything. But at the end of the day, I still don't think it's going to be as different of a change-up as people think it will be, because as we've said before, I think the most dramatic kind of divergence between the two will be Trump looking more towards escalation with Iran and Kamala looking more towards escalation with Russia. And then both of them are kind of pretty much in the same boat on China. Maybe the Republicans are slightly more hawkish on China, but not exactly. I mean, we know Nancy Pelosi is the one that goes and visits Taiwan and causes all of the international scandals. So very interesting developments as far as foreign policy goes when the election unfolds, which we're going to talk about in a moment. But I want to hear your thoughts on what you think this strike is going to be. Do you think Israel will strike first? Do you think Iran will strike first? Obviously, we know that there are multiple THAAD missile systems in Israel. Iran has claimed in the past that they are going to strike those if they retaliated against an Israeli response. So those could come under fire. I know Iran has claimed that they have the capabilities of wiping out up to 80% of Israel's desalination facilities, which would be devastating to obviously the Israeli water supply and their, basic civilizational existence. So it's a very interesting prospect. We know that the comments about Iran being able to go nuclear any day now were made. So perhaps Israel will just shock the world. And as we've said, we know that the capability of them to strike Iran's nuclear facilities exists. And we could wake up tomorrow, as the prophecies say, sipping our coffee, and that could have happened, which kind of makes sense. Everybody was kind of anticipating this recent strike to be the one, which that's not exactly how the prophecies say it's going to go down. They say it is going to surprise us. So that would definitely make sense. But before we move on to perhaps the ground operation in Lebanon, I want to know what you think, Dimitri, on who's going to strike next and what will it be? And then let's discuss Lebanon.
I think most definitely, given that Israel have been bolstering its defensive capabilities, and Israel really is knee-deep in the whole Lebanon situation. And frankly, with the election of the new chief of Hezbollah, who we'll discuss in a moment, I think Israel will be allowing Iran to strike first in order to, I suppose, retaliate in a more sort of prominent fashion without accruing all that negativity that it received from all of its Middle Eastern allies and neighbors, such as Oman, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, all these countries which typically you can see them as being pro-Israeli, have all condemned Israel's strikes against Iran more than a week ago. So I think that's very important, that Israel needs to be sort of needs to hold the virtue signaling high ground in this particular case. And so I think it'll even allow Iran to maybe even symbolically strike at its, not the desalination plants, but maybe against these so-called secret bases in the Negev desert and some of the other Israeli military facilities. Although we do note Iran last time did strike at the outskirts of Tel Aviv, for example, and they did strike actually urban locations as well, which led obviously to the deaths of less than 20 people overall. But I think generally speaking, we will see Iran most likely take the next step. And that's really important, I think, for Israel as well. And Israel, I think, is happy, given the entire October 7th situation. We know Israel is happy even to sacrifice some of its own people, because we have to understand the Talmudic Jewish mindset in this particular case is that, look, they have people in their nation who obviously conform less to the rabbinic tradition of, say, Orthodox Judaism and more to, say, liberal Western values. Those people are less valuable to, I suppose, the Israeli and the so-called elders that rule, say, globalist affairs. There's a potential, Conrad, that Israel values some of its population a lot less than others. I think comparatively speaking, if we have a look at what took place during October 7th, the fact that Israel allowed the entire festival to take place near the Gaza Strip, the fact that it allowed some of its military bases to drop their defenses and to allow Hamas in the first place to strike against them, shows that they're willing to actually sacrifice some of their own citizens in order to further potentially future goals and to further operations. So they're actually willing to sacrifice some pawns on the board. And these pawns in this case may be literally Israeli citizens, maybe Israeli military personnel. And if Iran does strike against those THAAD missile complexes, we have to keep in mind, part of me actually believes that there are potentially American personnel, just like there are Russian nuclear physicists and scientists most likely working at these nuclear facilities, maybe even instructing Iranian specialists in this area in the Iranian nuclear facilities. So there are probably US personnel working with these two THAAD missile defense launchers in Israel, as well as some of the other military facilities. So there is a potential for a black swan event on either side. Not to get too Alex Jonesian here, but there is a potential that we will see both American personnel losses in Syria, Iraq, and some of these bases if Iran does choose to strike against Israel. It doesn't mean that Iran won't strike against American bases either at the same time, because these drones that will fly from Iran, long range, all the way to Israel, they might be striking into sort of these intermission targets as well, which again are Israel-aligned United States targets. And in the same vein, I think if the US and Israel have a joint strike against Iran, they may be targeting places wherein Russian personnel are stationed. So this may cause, again, a further escalation going forward. And I think it's incredibly dangerous. And naturally, one of the reasons why I think Sergei Lavrov in particular has been very outspoken in terms of strengthening Russia's ties with Iran, showing that Iran should not be struck as openly again. On the 31st of October, he said that Russia is preparing a comprehensive strategic partnership between Russia and Iran. There is a treaty that's being drafted. We don't know the details of this treaty. Will it be as sort of close tied as that treaty which was recently signed and ratified between Russia and North Korea? We're not too sure. But I think going forward, I think the fact that Pezeshkian has been invited again to Russia, this time not to Kazan for the BRICS summit, but specifically to go to Moscow to meet with Vladimir Putin, to meet with Lavrov personally, this is really showing that Russia is actually the one who's working for peace in the Middle East, if anything. But Russia does not have all the leverage that the United States has in the Middle East. We have to keep that in mind. United States, and this is why we speak about this election more than, say, Putin's influence on Iran and Israel, because Putin cannot force Iran to do anything. If anything, Putin can only make recommendations and suggestions. Russia does not have enough leverage, unfortunately. Perhaps the only country in the Middle East that Russia really has true leverage over is not even Turkey, it's most likely Syria, right? Given the Russian bases in that country, given Russia's support for the Assad regime and the Assad family and just the free Syrian people and the Antiochian Orthodox Church there. This is the only sort of comprehensive relationship we have between Russia and any Middle Eastern state. Even with Israel, I think it's not that closely aligned. Russian interests are it's very much a trade-off with the Israelis. Given the number of Russian citizens who are living in Israel at the moment, I think Russia's not really willing to take that anti-Zionist position that I think most of us have been really pushing for, that Russia should align itself with the axis of resistance perhaps, and to perhaps quell Israeli Zionist aggression. Unfortunately, I don't think Russia has the potential to do that at the moment, although maybe it should, but I think it's not willing to make that mental calculation in its head of what the potential outcomes will be, especially if you consider the presence of the Moscow Patriarchate as well as the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, all that real estate, those monasteries, churches which require funding from various Russian sources abroad. We don't know what a Russian anti-Israeli position, I think even if you speak about it politically and in foreign policy, would even look like. How would that impact the Christians living in Israel and Greater Syria and even in Lebanon? So Russian interests, unfortunately, are very bound up in their own limitations. And I think not even potentially looking forward, this could be incredibly dangerous for Russia because, again, Russia potentially could take, people say, right? People are proclaiming, Conrad, this is Xi Jinping recently has also spoken out in favor of Iran's ability to defend itself. But Putin and Xi Jinping in particular do not have the same influence over what takes place in the Middle East as, say, a Donald Trump or even, unfortunately, a Kamala Harris may have. So we really need to keep this in mind. And this is why I think the entire situation feels somewhat hopeless for the good guys in this situation. By the good guys, I mean the anti-Zionist, anti-deep state coalition forming. Because again, the powers that be, China is very much tied into what's taking place in East Asia. Russia is very tied into what's taking place in Eastern Europe. Both countries are preoccupied. Iran is somewhat isolated and very much the pressure is on. And will Iran make the correct move here? And in fact, what even is the correct move, Conrad? Is the correct move retaliating and striking against Israel? Or is it to just hold back, turn the other cheek and allow Hezbollah to actually carry out its own strikes sort of independently of any Iranian foreign intervention? So again, it's a very complex situation and any sort of move here could lead to a major disaster, not just in the Middle East, but just across the world in general.
No, I think you're exactly correct with the calculus from Iran being very complicated. And I think a key aspect of why someone like the Ayatollah or the hardliners might be so desperate for a strike isn't just because they're so desperate to be the top dog in the deterrence game or that they are just bloodthirsty. I think there's a real need to relieve and, show Israel that they're with Hezbollah. Hezbollah is taking a lot of losses. The ground situation is interesting. There's rumors that the Israelis are already starting to withdraw from certain areas after they've done what they had to do in these tunnels. The Smotrich is saying that by 2025, like January 1st, 2025, the Lebanon ground invasion will be over, but there is some contradicting language on that. But going back to something you said earlier, you talked about the possibility of false flags. It's true. Lloyd Austin is openly deploying more B-52s and tanks and naval destroyers to the entire region as, the impending strikes on Israel. As you mentioned, it is more likely that Iran will be the one to strike here again, as there was the Israeli strikes within Iran, and there now are these, again, escalating strikes within Lebanon. The Israelis are telling people to evacuate from Baalbek, which is in northeast Lebanon, full evacuation of a town, 18,000 people, very high population of Christians. In fact, my bishop, Metropolitan Saba, at one point, he was the bishop of Baalbek in Lebanon. So these are very real things that are going on. And the likelihood of one of these Iranian missiles somehow hitting the U.S., they've openly said they're going to strike the U.S. THAAD batteries, which that's $1 billion right there, which that might start to get people angry just on that alone. So there's all sorts of trigger points that could be used to trigger the U.S.'s involvement in this broader conflict. But as the Lebanon ground operation continues to unfold, obviously Israel is not making massive gains. I don't know if they've even achieved 10 kilometers from a straight line deep into Lebanon quite yet. I know they've taken, 6.5, 7.8 square kilometers, kilometers in rather, in some of these areas. They have taken some towns. It's real. They've blown up entire towns, entire town centers. They've literally leveled them, the entire complex that is a walled-ish city or something like that. They'll just blow it all up because apparently there's tunnels underneath it and all this kind of stuff. But it's a full-on, just wiping clean this slate that they want to make greater Israel. So it's very dramatic. But the new Secretary General of Hezbollah, they've been elected and he's revealed himself and he's given a speech. That is Naim Qassem, who is a familiar face to people that keep up with Hezbollah politics and, the intricacies of the current war against Israel. And he is now the head, and he made this big address. And I'm going to read some of what it says. This is translation from Turkey Today. At the beginning of the speech, it starts with, "We have many sacrifices ahead of us. We are confident that victory will be ours. We are not fighting on behalf of anyone, but to protect Lebanon and liberate our land in support of Gaza." He said Israel is trying to invade Lebanon to bring in Jewish settlers. "The legendary steadfastness of the resistance in Gaza and Lebanon will shape the future of our generations. We said for 11 months that we do not want war, but we are ready to win if it is imposed on us." So he's, obviously talking about, there's a picture of Nasrallah literally next to him as he's giving this speech, and he's talking about the fact that, they said they don't want war, but now the missile strikes are escalating dramatically. There have been some very large missile salvos, despite the fact that Yoav Gallant and other IDF officials have claimed that, only 20% of Hezbollah's missile capabilities still exist. I don't know if that's real, if that was ever true. If not, obviously they're clearly still able to resupply from Syria, despite rumors that, Syrian forces are trying to disrupt that supply chain. Again, I have no idea how true that is. I was talking to Maram about it, and she hadn't seemed to hear about that from any legitimate sources. But, Qasem goes on to say in his speech, "This is an Israeli, American, European global war aimed at eliminating the resistance in the region. Israel does not need pretext to surprise us with an attack. Israel's aggressive intentions towards Lebanon were clear. We will remain on the path of war with the planned developments. We are fighting for freedom of Palestine and Lebanon." He then goes on to praise Iran's support, expressing gratitude to resistance movements in Yemen and Iraq. "Killing of Hassan Nasrallah and explosions on pagers and radios were significant blows, but we have recovered and continue resistance," says Qasem. "I thank the Shura Hezbollah leadership for trusting me and choosing me for this heavy burden," he said, and added, "The Israeli enemy has been attacking Lebanon daily since 2006. So, this was the kind of first address, him kind of introducing himself in this format, the undisclosed location, black background, headdress sort of thing going on, the address. This is, in theory, this guy could reign for another 2 weeks like the previous Hezbollah leader did, Nasrallah's cousin, or he could be in power for 30 plus years like Nasrallah was. He was a known face within the region. Everybody in Lebanon obviously knew who he was. He was probably the most well-known Lebanese politician, because I don't know anybody else worldwide that knows that many of these other Christian or Sunni or other, Druze politicians or anything like that. So, the speech, it's fairly strong. It seems that they are, on the one hand, they're saying they're not the aggressors. They're making it very clear that this is a full-on war. People are dying on the ground. Missiles are being launched. Hezbollah does not want Israel to be able to achieve its goal of moving the settlers, the 60,000 plus Israeli settlers, back to the north, let alone, give up their region in the south. But it does seem that Israel is making certain victories in the areas that they have claimed, but I have no idea if they are losing on the ground and not being able to push in as much as they think they can, or if they are succeeding. And, both sides are kind of claiming both things, so it's hard to judge exactly. But I'm curious what you think Israel's immediate goals are on this front, and then we can probably move to Syria and then to Russia.
I think at this point, it's become quite clear that any further sort of push into Lebanon is going to incur massive Israeli personnel losses. And what I mentioned earlier about Israel actually willing to sacrifice a lot of these early IDF conscripts, a lot of them are actually from abroad. These are Israelis who are living overseas for work, or maybe even these are young men in their 20s, right? Or even most of them men, by the way. All the propaganda videos of Israeli women fighting in the IDF, that's just a very minority. It's probably less than 5%. So we have to just keep that in mind. So most of these Israeli men are actually living very so-called non-Orthodox Jewish lives abroad. A lot of them come from Ukraine. Thousands, in fact, of Ukrainian Jews actually traveled to Israel after October 7th, became conscripted, and they joined the military directly in order to support the IDF in their home state of Israel. So we have to keep in mind, a lot of these people, I think the elites of Israel really see as pawns that they can throw away. So I think once the election is over, regardless of who wins, whether it's Kamala or whether it's Donald Trump, I think Israel will then proceed to push further against Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. I do not think Israel is going to sort of lessen its goals here and maybe even retreat out of southern Lebanon, especially given that it's very clear that Hezbollah at this point, despite the fact, Naim Qassem's speech was very powerful, but it's quite clear that Hezbollah is very much in a similar complex situation as Iran is. Hezbollah is losing support from the Lebanese elites in Beirut, in northern Lebanon, who again support a more pro-Zionist, pro-American position. Hezbollah understands that, well, it hasn't really received direct support from Russia. The Assad regime is quite weak. Iran is very much in a complex situation. Hezbollah is very much left alone as an organization and maybe even as a political sort of military power. And in fact, I think Israel can smell the blood in the water, and they'll be certainly moving in. I think there's no way Israel would kind of let this potential victory go, and they'll be pushing further up into the Litani River sort of region in South Lebanon. I do not think Israel will be retreating in any capacity. And part of that, I think, can be seen in Naim Qassem's speech, which you mentioned, because notice how he mostly speaks about Lebanon, about Hezbollah, and the sort of Lebanese struggle against the Israeli occupation. Palestine is mentioned very few times in it. So it's less about Hamas, less about the Palestinian people who have been suffering over the past year, and you can say not just year, but literally decades at this point, and more about actually rousing up and imploring the Lebanese people to rise up in sort of promoting Lebanese nationalism to rise up against the Israeli invasion. I think Naim Qassem understands that Lebanon and Hezbollah at the moment face a really potent enemy in their particular situation. And in fact, he needs to appeal to the Lebanese people because the Palestinians are preoccupied with literally fighting for their very own existence. So in a way, the battle has been divided essentially for Israel on two fronts. And Naim Qassem, I think, we can kind of see that in his speech, which I think is very interesting because if you remember Nasrallah's speech from maybe just over like 6 months ago, Nasrallah's speech was very much about Palestine, not so much about the Lebanese people. Here we see a bit of a switch up now that I suppose the totality of Lebanon is kind of threatened by Israeli strikes. So I think that speaks a lot, speaks to where the attention of Hezbollah lies and exactly what the threat to the Lebanese people actually is. Because I think Hezbollah, despite it being a sort of religious organization, very Shia focused, I think they are concerned for probably the sovereignty of Lebanon as a whole. It's not just that they care simply about themselves and about their own influence and power. So keeping that in mind. But I think the other sort of bad news that we've received over the last week, which kind of hinders some of our positive points that we mentioned last week, was the fact that the Saudi Arabian Foreign Minister, Prince Faisal bin Farhan, has denied the fact that Saudi Arabia and Iran are going to be carrying out naval joint drills in the Red Sea. I think this is a major change to what was mentioned, right? We specifically said that, in light of the BRICS summit taking place, in light of everything else, this is a huge move towards potentially peace in the Middle East between the two major Sunni and Shia countries, right? But in fact, the foreign minister, Prince Farhan, actually denied this very openly. So what exactly this means, very concerning. Did Anthony Blinken, this sort of Judeo-Christian representative of the United States, did he have an impact on this by meeting with the Saudi Arabian Crown Prince? We're not too sure here. But the other really interesting thing is, again, Prince Faisal bin Farhan has, again, reiterated that regardless of all of its potential anti-Iranian positions, Saudi Arabia still remains a very strong supporter of Palestine. And I'm going to quote him. He says, "What is happening in the northern Gaza Strip is a form of genocide. Normalization of Israel is not on the agenda before finding a solution for the establishment of a Palestinian state." Again, this is also reflected in the fact that at the BRICS summit last week, there was that very clear meeting. The Palestinian president from the West Bank, Mahmoud Abbas, was actually present there in Kazan. So notice the Palestinian representation at the BRICS summit was also present, and so was a Saudi Arabian representation. So again, we see Saudi Arabia taking this neutral position once again just before the US election, which again doesn't paint a very nice picture for what's taking place. We do understand Saudi Arabia is very strong and friendly ties with the United States and Israel, so incredibly concerning. At the same time, we have very vague statements from Lavrov. Again, it's very Lavrovian foreign policy taking place here. He states that Russia is willing to facilitate peace talks between Lebanon and Israel, which is quite bizarre because Lebanon is not at war with Israel. Israel has made it quite clear that it's simply fighting against Hezbollah directly. And the Lebanese government has not announced a war or even a special peaceful military operation against Israel at this point. In fact, they're very much denying Israel's invasion overall. So I think we see this almost like dichotomy of positions. Despite that Lebanese citizens are literally being bombed, threatened directly, the Lebanese government is very much occupied, very much under intense international pressure to not declare war against Israel or even a mobilization of any sort. We do not see the Lebanese government. Mm-hmm.
We may, just to give you an update, I want to hear what you say, just to continue. This is from Al Arabiya. This was just released as we're recording the show. That's Saudi state media. For those that don't know, they're quoting a Lebanese political official who says, "We expect greater escalation in the coming days after the failure of negotiations." So apparently, I do remember earlier this week, there were leaked ceasefire ideas leaked from Israel. I think they were in English, but that's probably because they were formulated by Amos Hochstein and the U.S. envoys in collaboration with the IDF and with whatever people they're talking with in Lebanon. And that was leaked, and people were discussing how those plans are all now getting thrown out the water because of the leak, and now it seems that those have broken down anyway. So continue. I didn't want to interrupt, but some breaking news.
No, absolutely. The other thing I just wanted to mention is just generally speaking, if we look at the overall situation in the Middle East, US involvement is, of course, increasing. We've noticed Trump, again, placating this idea that the United States is, in fact, the police officer looking after Middle Eastern peace affairs. He's made that very clear when he stated that the US has, they took down the ISIS caliphate, right, during his presidency. He made that, he underlined that in the Joe Rogan episode. J.D. Vance also made references to that. And again, there's this idea that there isn't really a discussion of exactly who created ISIS. Is ISIS Shia related, which it isn't. It's really its own sort of Salafi organization, which again has no relation to Iran whatsoever. But for the general American audience, it's almost as if once you placate and you sort of represent Iran as this major enemy in the Middle East and ISIS at the same time, the general American audience may not even know the difference here. They may even think, oh, well, it's just Islamic extremists. And most likely these two groups are aligned. And so we have this really crazy story again from Syria. Just a few hours ago, actually, the US confirmed an airstrike against a series of ISIS bases in Syria, actually in the Syrian desert, and they killed 35 ISIS operatives. And this is almost like the Kamala Harris, Joe Biden government kind of cementing their position like, hey, look, we can also carry out strikes. The US military is still present in the Middle East. We are still strong, just as Donald Trump was back in the day. We are willing to take down these extremists. And the question again arises as to what the general American audience, kind of how it views Hezbollah, how it views Hamas, the Palestinians. Unfortunately, we do see people like Kamala Harris, again, sort of promoting this pro-Zionist position. Her husband recently made very pro-Jewish, pro-Zionist statements very openly. So again, just looking at generally the election, Conrad, I don't think anything is looking up for Lebanon at the moment. I think there's this general image being painted in the minds of Americans who, again, this will be the main group of people in the world, hundreds of millions of adult Americans who will be potentially supporting a US sort of Israel-backed coalition to clear out Hezbollah, the so-called terrorist organization in southern Lebanon. I think we'll see this collective effort on behalf of the mainstream media in the US to bolster the support of, I guess, United States citizenry and their view of what Hezbollah is, how it's a danger to US and Israeli interests, and to support Israel's strikes against Hezbollah. So Hezbollah is very much, I think, on the chopping block here. The threats have not been reduced. And I think the Lebanese government's silence on the entire invasion issue really paints that image that they're going to allow Israel to enter into southern Lebanon all the way up to the Litani River and directly fight with Hezbollah without intervening in any sort of capacity, without signing any security treaties with Syria, with Russia, with Turkey, or with any other state who is somewhat skeptical of the Zionist position on the Levante issue. So this is incredibly concerning. I think moving forward, sort of into the next week, I think we'll see further developments in this particular direction, this anti-Hezbollah position that will be pushed all over American media. And because they'll just claim Hezbollah is essentially a terrorist proxy created by Iran, it needs to be destroyed. And I think most American citizens, fooled by the mainstream media, will definitely continue supporting this position in favor of the so-called greatest ally.
No, that's 100% true. And we're already seeing in Lebanon, Lebanese Christian officials, Maronite, and even Druze officials are ramping up their anti-Shia rhetoric. We are hearing that from specific Lebanese officials, they're viewing this entire invasion as the opportunity to free themselves from the Tehran yoke and to completely rid themselves of Hezbollah and all these other sorts of things. Druze officials are organizing pogroms against Shia people within their villages and areas. So all of the, the Talmudic puppets have been activated within Lebanon, which again, to any Zionist is just northern greater Israel. And that is what they see it as, what they're trying to achieve. And going a little farther north and then going east to Syria, there's still the ongoing clashes in Syria. Turkey has declared the border provinces of Syria and Turkey as, special security zones. Citizens are not able to move freely around. There's security checkpoints, and all of these things have been set up. In fact, in their war against the PKK, the Turks have blown up, U.S.-related ammo depots because we know how close the U.S. and the PKK work, and there's still that kind of three-way battle going on between U.S. proxies, Turkish proxies, and Russian forces allied with Bashar al-Assad. All of that is still ongoing, and sort of building that bridge towards the Ukraine conflict. This was probably the most interesting comment I found from Lavrov all week. He said, Turkey, on one hand, is ready to mediate in the Russian-Ukraine conflict, which makes Ankara's military technical cooperation with Ukraine very puzzling. He said this in an interview with Turkish outlet Hurriyet. So clearly this is Lavrov sending a message to Turkey, like, we know that you guys are deep down siding with Ukraine, and that's who behind the scenes you're allying with. I'm surprised he hasn't been bringing up some of the Syria stuff. I think they're still leaning on Erdogan's, at this point, months, even year-old promise to normalize relations with Assad, it doesn't seem like he's in a hurry to do that. I think he'll die before the Turkish government achieves that, because that is not on his priorities list, and they have only escalated their operations within Syria. So I don't know why Russia is still kind of trusting their word on that, but they seem to be not wanting to escalate things between Turkey and Assad, but they're still calling out Turkey and what's going on in Ukraine. We remember that all of Ukraine's drones initially, those all came from, those came from Turkey. So that's what's going on there. And obviously on the front lines in Ukraine, we are seeing Russia advance all across. Ukraine has basically given up on Donbass and are only reinforcing, Zaporozhye and Dnipro provinces, and a lot of territory is falling, and, a lot of updates all across the front line. But in Kursk, the big news is supposedly certain people are claiming that they've confirmed North Korean troops on the front lines in Ukraine. So, Dmitry, I want to hear your thoughts on the North Korean situation. I know Lavrov is meeting with the North Korean foreign minister, but before you tell me a bit about what's going on in Donbass and elsewhere, I want to know what is happening in Kursk. Are there North Korean troops there? And, has this treaty that the Russians and the North Koreans signed, has this been activated?
Look, the official news from Russia and North Korea, at least from the governments, is that there are no North Korean troops currently being involved. And in fact, they're not denying it openly, but they're just stating that their citizens should not believe Western propaganda and misinformation. So it's not really an outright denial. It's just sort of a pivot, and they're controlling the narrative in order to not affirm it or confirm it. But I think given the recent stories we've seen, the various clips on Telegram of potentially North Koreans, some people are claiming, these are Buryats or Yakuts or people from, small ethnic, Asiatic-looking Oriental citizens of the Russian Federation traveling across the Trans-Siberian Railway from east to west, because again, these North Korean troops essentially were transferred from the Korean Peninsula by major ships, allegedly to Vladivostok, where they were all equipped. They were given equipment, standard Russian uniforms. They will be dressed according to the Russian military standards, which again vary depending on which Russian battalion or brigade you're a member of. Again, the Russian military, in sort of equipping its troops, there's really been major issues throughout the entire SMO. So I think all the North Koreans were given a privilege even over that of the standard Russian recruit soldier, which is why I think in the Russian Federation in particular, a lot of those military experts, or those who want to join specifically, those who want to fight in the SMO are actually joining volunteer brigades or even Wagner directly, in fact, not really conscripting themselves into the Russian Ministry of Defense structure. I think that's very clear. The official Russian army is very disintegrated. There's not much unity over exactly what kind of equipment they're receiving. But nevertheless, these, allegedly, according to US intelligence, there are a confirmed 8,000 North Koreans in the Russian Federation at the moment. The South Korean sources have given us a number of 13,000, again, slightly over what was predicted a few weeks ago. And these North Koreans will be apparently traveling from Vladivostok across the Trans-Siberian Railway, thousands of kilometers all the way to Nizhny Novgorod, which is located not too far from Kursk and Moscow. And from Nizhny, they'll be, again, traveling across the major highways and freeways all the way to the SMO, probably the Rostov-on-Don Oblast, maybe even Donetsk. It's very interesting, perhaps even to the Kursk Oblast officially. And there are major concerns. A lot of Russian political commentators have been stating, well, if this is even true, how exactly are we going to work together with these North Koreans? Because it's almost like only 1 in 10 North Korean officers can actually speak Russian or even understand it legibly. There isn't really any proper AI translating service. Again, electronics on the front lines are very much limited. We understand using electronics on the front lines is already a risk for Russia, given that there's all kinds of technologies and spycraft being used by the Western sources, Western mercenaries, NATO equipment, and all kinds of other Ukrainian technologies being utilized on the front lines. There's certain concerns that the Russians are pushing out there. In fact, what exactly will these North Koreans assist Russia in doing? Because again, if you consider the total force of the Russian SMO force, I guess, Conrad, as Putin mentioned earlier this year, it was roughly around 600,000. We know that the Russians on the front line believe that there are maybe 200,000 Russians in the immediate sort of vicinity of the front lines, all across, hundreds of kilometers, all the way from Kursk down to Khersonsk Oblast in Crimea. And what exactly is 10,000 or even 8,000 North Koreans going to do? It's kind of like a drop in the bucket. It's maybe a 5% difference. Where exactly can these 10,000 North Koreans show up? In fact, a good friend of mine actually mentioned that this entire North Korean story could be a distraction, being sort of pushed by the West and pushed by Ukraine amidst these elections in order to distract from the major losses that Ukraine is incurring, right, on the front line, specifically in the Donetsk Oblast, where they've recently lost the major town of Selidovo, which, again, these major towns are covering very important roadways through the Donetsk Oblast. And now Russia is very deeply pushing into Pokrovsk, and it's very much on the Pokrovsk outskirts. Toretsk is more or less captured by Russia. There's definitely a stalemate taking place in, say, the Kharkovsk Oblast in Volchansk, some very intense fighting in Volchansk as well. In fact, the best Russian military surgeon and doctor is currently operating in Volchansk. I think he's commanding his own corps. This is Yuri Yevich, and he actually creates his own documentaries film, Volchansk. The battles there in the Kharkovsk Oblast are incredibly intense. So we can see some major Russian people on the front lines. For example, the former governor of Novorossiya, Igor Strelkov's friend, Pavel Gubaryov, if you recall him, he was one of the key figures in the entire 2014 debacle on the Russian side. He's actually in the Donetsk Oblast at the moment, fighting literally in the trenches against Ukrainian drones, Ukrainian infantrymen. Yuri Yevich, he's a major Russian doctor, as I said, fighting in Volchansk. There are some really key, I suppose, Russian military celebrities, you can say, very patriotic right-wing figures fighting on the front lines again. And Russia is making very progressive gains across the entire front line. And even Kursk, it's confirmed even by Ukrainian sources that Russia has recaptured 50% of its territory in the Kursk Oblast. Again, Sudzha remains under Ukrainian control. And just generally speaking, I think wherever these North Koreans show up, it'll be just a major news story, Conrad, but let it not distract us from the fact that the Russians are perhaps the most experienced military force probably on the planet at the moment. I would say even the Russian infantry in particular, as they siege these individual buildings, apartments, villages, they are growing more and more experienced. There's many very experienced Russian fighters, which the North Koreans would not be able to. I guess the only thing North Koreans will be able to do is, in fact, learn from their Russian counterparts, if in fact the language barrier can be breached. But I think in terms of like powerful imagery, right, let's just focus on, say, PR at the moment. The fact that the North Korean foreign minister arrived in Moscow with Lavrov, they met at one of the major railway stations, and in the background you see this Russian chapel with an icon, a huge icon of St. Sergius of Radonezh, and you see it's really cool. Lavrov standing there, the North Korean foreign minister, and again, a huge Orthodox Christian icon of St. Sergius in the background. And it's just that imagery of, well, perhaps North Koreans will be for the first time introduced to a form of Christianity which perhaps they had no idea even existed. A non-Western, I would say non-Zionist, non-globalist controlled form of Christianity which perhaps they will be introduced to for the first time, because a lot of these people are deeply agnostic, deeply atheistic. Perhaps they've never even focused on the sort of spiritual life. So again, there are other positive factors besides just the realist military view of, well, North Koreans will help Russia recapture certain Kursk villages, or maybe they'll learn some military tactics. Just like we mentioned last week and the week before, there's a certain spiritual angle to all of this, and there's huge benefits to be had from Russian cooperation with North Korea, despite the fact that North Korea at the moment is literally atheistic and a communistic state. I think we just need to take that into account. Russia is the only country in the world who can probably influence North Korea to develop itself in a more positive way, rather than allow the West and all these Western countries like Japan, South Korea, the United States to influence North Korea to find itself and become more liberal and open and degenerate. I think this is, when we speak about the Japanese elections, we'll kind of see a really good contrast to what's happening in North Korea.
It is a very interesting development indeed. And of course, North Korea on the home front have been making very massive preparations along its border, within its military industrial complex, for what they perceive as an impending war with South Korea, or rather a escalation within the ongoing Korean War that technically never ended and never had a treaty signed. So that's obviously ongoing. And as the escalation goes on in Ukraine, like you mentioned, the territorial gains start to, again, we hear Lukashenko calling for Zelensky to come to the table with negotiations without preconditions. We heard Putin's call for negotiations, while at the same time he said that in the same sentence he'll say for negotiations, but then say, but we'll also let the situation on the ground, unfold on its own. So I don't know, Putin, you are the one with the power to call for the negotiations at this point. So I don't know who he's talking to when he says those things, but the attacks, there's these X-69 missiles that have been fired on Odessa and other Nikolaev and other port cities that are still in the Ukrainian-controlled territories. And, rumors are that they've been using cluster munitions on these territories, and these strikes have been bigger. So there is, some evidence that perhaps eventually those cities will come under the target of the Russian Navy, and then more so the Russian armed forces as they advance from Crimea, eventually take Kherson, and then use Kherson as a launching off point into the rest of coastal Ukraine. So that is what's on the horizon there. But some updates quickly as things come in the news, Friday night, things tend to happen. That's why, I don't know, maybe we need to change when we record the show, but, big ballistic missile strikes in Tel Aviv have been recorded in the Sharon district, specifically Khor HaSharon, which that's where headquarters of Mossad are located. So hasn't been confirmed anything, but perhaps at least near Mossad headquarters, ballistic missiles have touched down. So crazy things going on in World War III as we are sitting here in our proverbial bunker covering it as the missiles fly. But unless you have anything else to talk about on the front line, specifically in Ukraine, Dmitry, like I said, the huge trenches are confirmed by the satellite imagery in Zaporozhye. So there's a rumor that 8 new battalions are being recruited by the Russian military for a massive front, from Zaporozhye, as well as to retake the rest of Donbass that hasn't been taken yet. Perhaps I think that might even include 1 or 2 battalions for the Kharkov region. So very interesting developments, as even The Economist magazine admits that Ukraine isn't fighting to win anymore, or fighting to hold the line. They're just fighting to survive at this point, and it's frankly not working. As we've explained, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of square kilometers are being retaken at this point on a weekly basis by the Russians. But you mentioned the BRICS summit, Dmitry. I want to talk about this brief fun escalation, and this is from AP. It says, India says frontier disengagement with China along their disputed border is almost complete. India and China have moved most of their frontline troops further from their disputed border in a remote region in the northern Himalayas. India's defense minister said on Thursday, some 10 days after the two countries reached a new pact on military patrols that aims to end a 4-year standoff that strained relations. Rajnath Singh said that the process of disengagement of India and Chinese troops near the line of actual control in Ladakh is almost complete. Ties between the two countries deteriorated in July 2020 after a military clash killed at least 20 Indian soldiers and 4 Chinese. That turned into a long-running standoff in the rugged mountainous area. We know about this. We've talked about how, they can only use sticks because they don't deploy artillery or even, basic firearms to the region to prevent escalations. But the Chinese were able to drive a large amount of the Indian soldiers off of a cliff, and that was how they were able to die. It was a very crazy escalation. You can look at some of the footage from some of these encounters. They're in these gorges with these rivers, and they look like they're something out of Starship Troopers or something like that. That's the uniforms that they look like they're in. But it says earlier this month, the two neighbors announced a border accord aimed at ending the standoff following a meeting between India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Chinese President Xi Jinping on the sidelines of the recent BRICS summit in Russia, their first bilateral meeting in 5 years. So that's a good sign. We like to see that. We don't want to see India leveraged against China as, the other comparable population power. Of course, we know that if they're, Olympic gold medal record relative to their population means anything, their military will never be able to compete, with real militaries. I'm sorry, India, but that's just the truth. But it is nice to see these disputes in the Himalayas being resolved, because the U.S. was trying to use that towards India by, recognizing Ladakh and Arunachal Pradesh as Indian as opposed to Chinese. So without any input from China, of course. So that's an interesting development. But speaking of countries that are trying to reestablish bilateral relations, the elections in Georgia are having their fallout, as we discussed, of course, the results last show. So go back and listen to that if you didn't hear it. But in the midst of everything that's gone on, President Salom Zarabushvili, the total nonsense, Western puppet president of Georgia, she stood in front of the huge crowd in Tbilisi and basically said that the election was illegitimate and it was stolen by the Russians and this, that, and the other, and we need to stand in the streets. And then she was, of course, summoned by the Election Commission to basically answer for effectively calling for a coup in Georgia, and she's refusing to answer the commission's call to show up. So we're seeing big protests. Unfortunately, these protests are not as big as I think even some of the pro-Georgian dream and some of the anti-LGBT protests we've seen in the past. And in the past, when we had other color revolutions in Georgia that, led to other expulsions of Russian influence in the past, in the late 2000s and early 2010s. And these times, the crowds are not that size. So it appears that the elections were legitimate. I believe 54% of Georgians actually did vote for the Georgian Dream Party, who, again, is called pro-Russian. Yet they're called pro-Russian despite the fact that the leaders of the party are already saying that, sure, even though we don't want to become a second Ukraine and we don't want to become this front for the West to wage another war against Russia, we're not just immediately ready to recognize and reopen relations with Russia. They're still occupying what we consider Georgian territory. They're talking about Abkhazia and South Ossetia, but at the same time, they also recognize that if Georgia sanctions Russia, it's just over for the Georgian economy. And the West just went too far in the EU, and in their attempts to get Georgia into the EU and into all of these cooperation organizations, it's clear that they were trying to get Georgia to maximize its resistance to Russia. And the Georgian economy, even the most libtarded Westoid Georgian, has to recognize that the inseparability of the Russian and Georgian economies, and that would just be incapable. I mean, the Georgians would just not be able to handle that, obviously. So we're in a good direction in Georgia. I don't think this attempted color revolution will succeed. We've heard rumors that, Georgian legionaries that had went to Ukraine to fight are coming back and that they're trying to snipe people and provoke, a color revolution and claim that it was Russian influence. All these sorts of rumors are spreading. But again, I haven't seen any actual evidence produced from President Salome or any of these Western NGOs that huge Russian influence actually occurred in this election. So I think the Georgian dream is going to succeed and they're going to stay in power. And that's a very good sign for Georgia, because recently, if people watched videos from Metropolitan Neophytos, we posted this on our social media as well. He talks about prophecies from St. Philomenos of Jacob's Well, who talks about, and St. Gabriel Ergabadze of Georgia as well, who talk about the Russians descending through Georgia to wage the war with the Turks. And it kind of leaves it open ambivalently. Will Georgia have to get crushed by the Russians first, or will the Russians sort of be allowed to peacefully go through the Caucasus and then enter Turkey to wage, the historic, the catastrophic World War III that will also ultimately, as St. Philomenos prophesied, he said that the Russians will end up, outside of Mount Tabor. So the situation in Georgia, I think, is very relevant to that, very specific and very military strategic prophecy from a very beloved saint here on the show. So I'm wondering your thoughts on the Georgia situation. Dimitri, are you seeing, the Russian Empire slowly but surely returning in the Caucasus?
Well, no, just need to mention really briefly, but there was an interview with Yuri Yevich earlier. This is the figure from Volchansk I mentioned, very influential man in general. I think I'll be mentioning him a lot more. In fact, he's a good friend of Igor Strelkov, Pavel Gubaryov. He's been fighting on the Russian front lines for the last 10 years because he's literally from Donetsk. So he's probably one of the most experienced military medics in the entire world, most likely top 10. And he quite openly, very, very aggressively stated that if Georgians do not reassert themselves as Russia's ally, Russia may need to have another visit to Georgia, may need to pay, maybe produce a special military operation in order to save the Georgians from their liberal hegemons. I mean, very openly, this is a very influential man. His YouTube channel has over 500,000 subscribers, which is quite a bit considering that YouTube is very much algorithmically suppressed in Russia and around the world. So just keep in mind the Russian patriots on the front lines are very triggered at the fact that a very large portion of the Georgian population is pro-Western and anti-Russian. And in fact, the fact that Russia even controls South Ossetia and Abkhazia, this is 20 to 25% of the Georgian, I suppose, geographic sovereign territory. You can say, well, formerly Georgian. Then you can kind of see Russia's threats towards Georgia in the future, if Georgia takes this sort of pro-Western position, are very, very real, I think. And this is despite the fact that recently this election, of course, paints a very different picture. The fact that new Georgian Prime Minister Irakli Kobakidze, he's very much, Lavrov has congratulated him. Aliyev has, on the 30th of October, he traveled just south of the border to Azerbaijan. He's met with Aliyev at the Baku presidential palace. So he's met with all the sort of regional leaders. He's already essentially seen as this new leader of Georgia, as opposed to the president of Georgia, who is, Salome Zurabishvili, you mentioned. She is very much the presidential role, similar to like in Israel. You have Benjamin Netanyahu, who's the prime minister, and you have the president of Israel, who many don't even know by name because he's simply a ceremonial sort of constitutional figure, in fact. And it's similar in Georgia. So Zurabishvili, the president of Georgia, is very much a ceremonial sort of position, and the prime minister really does have a lot of sway on exactly what laws are passed in Georgia. And this is important, Conrad, because we recall in May of this year, the famous foreign agent bill was passed in Georgia. Turkey at the moment is trying to pass a very similar bill and sort of pass it through their parliament at the moment in Ankara. And this is very key because, again, these claims that Russian foreign agents are influencing these Georgian parliamentary elections are really based on nothing. There's literally a law on the books in Georgia that if you're a foreign agent, be you Russian, American, Zionist, etc., Azerbaijani, for example, Azeri, you'll essentially be breaking the law. You're essentially a criminal, and you can be imprisoned or even fined for espionage, for example. So at the moment, Georgia, technically, legally speaking, is defended against any sort of foreign influence. But again, that's on the papers. It doesn't stop Salome Zurabishvili from making these incredibly provocative statements. And, we did post in our Telegram that very interesting clip from Ukraine. And we mentioned last week a lot of Ukrainian NGOs, journalists, very aggressive sort of liberal spokespersons were traveling to Georgia to cover the parliamentary elections, to essentially paint the Georgian Dream Party as essentially a branch of the Russian government. And what's interesting is the Ukrainian famous journalist, and I call him Ukrainian in sort of parentheses because this guy, and not just single parentheses, we'll apply triple parentheses to this particular character, Vitaly Portnikov. If you search him up on Wikipedia, his early life doesn't really provide a very clear definition of who he is. But if you check the Russian Wikipedia, it clearly states who his parents are. This is a key person who participated in the 2013, 2014 Ukrainian Maidan. He openly considers himself a Zionist. I'm not even going to mention who his parents are. I think it's very clear. This is a very popular Ukrainian journalist, most likely top 5 most influential journalist in Ukraine. And just like Gordon, who we mentioned, the famous Ukrainian journalist who is clearly of the Talmudic kind as well, Vitaly Portnikov came on television and actually proclaimed the Georgian Church, the Georgian Orthodox Church, as the enemy of EU and NATO integration. Quite openly on Ukrainian television, stated that just the fact that Georgians are Orthodox kind of prevents them from integrating themselves with the greater sort of European family of progressive enlightened nations. And this is incredibly concerning. That means the sort of eye of Sauron of globalists is actually looking at Orthodoxy as the main enemy. And we've known they've been doing this since the 1990s, since the end of the Cold War, and probably not even since then, most likely since the time of Pentecost in the New Testament age. So we know that the enemy of mankind has always focused on Orthodox Christianity as the main enemy of essentially bringing about the reign of the Antichrist. And in Georgia in particular, even the very small Georgian Orthodox Church, which only has a maximum of 3 million members, it's still an enemy. And this jurisdiction is going to come under attack. The very interesting comments by Prime Minister of Georgia, this new Prime Minister, Irakli Kobahidze, he actually clearly stated that the Georgian Orthodox Church supports the Georgian Dream Party. But if we really look at the statement, Conrad, what does this mean? Does that mean that 40+% of Georgians did not vote according to the Orthodox Church because they voted against this party? It's a very, very powerful statement by him. It's similar to, say, Vladimir Putin saying that the Orthodox Church of Russia supports united Russia. But, in this particular case, a good 40% of Georgians actually did not vote for the Georgian Dream, which means that potentially, despite the fact that Georgia is a 95% plus Orthodox Christian country, there's still a very large portion of the population similar to Ukraine, who, despite the fact that the majority of the country is baptized and so-called churched or even a nominally Orthodox Christian, the liberal disease infiltrates so deeply that it can even subvert first the person's culture, then their ideology, and it eventually can lead a lot of them into potential heresy and even a denial of their own Orthodox Christian roots and ethical and, I suppose, even moral, normative life principles, I think. And this was very clear in Ukraine, where essentially a good portion of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church went into schism. Other people went into direct and clear apostasy. We saw this, of course, in Cherkasy, where literally the mayor of the city proclaimed himself as not a member of the Orthodox Church and was anathematized. So there is a very clear NATO-esque takeover project in Georgia, which has been essentially put on hold by this victory. But I think the battle is not over. I think the West is clearly viewing Georgia as this next potential actor who can play out against Russia. But this particular election victory could be sort of putting those plans on hold for the enemies of mankind, I would say. And so in many ways, this is very a positive development. And hopefully Irakli Kobahidze could visit Putin in Russia, could speak to Lavrov, could speak to maybe even Patriarch Kirill. I'm not sure if Irakli can speak Russian. I know he's multilingual, but hopefully they could sort of cement this bilateral relationship between Georgia and the Russian Federation that, looking forward, can maybe delay this use of Georgia as essentially another so-called meat factory, which the West will use against Russia in a future Russo-Georgian war, just as in 2008, as they tried to use the government of Georgia in order to commence a war against the Russian people. Fortunately, that ended just several weeks in, and it really didn't turn into a special military operation type scenario. So generally speaking, I think Salome Zurabashvili should definitely be replaced, should be investigated clearly for trying to cause an uprising. She's surrounded by literally American, EU, Ukrainian spokespersons as she's proclaiming these provocative statements. She should be investigated for literally being a foreign agent according to the Georgians' own law of the Foreign Agents Bill. And I think Prime Minister Irakli Kobahidze should take a very, not just a pro-Russian, but a pro-Georgian position on this and really begin prosecuting these foreign agents who literally wish to use the Georgian people as a sort of meat factory of soldiers to send them in to fight against Russia in the future. I think, because again, we know how these globalists work, Conrad. They're going to use, as you said, former citizens of the Russian Empire, because we do remember Georgia was a part of the Russian Empire more than 100 years ago, against essentially their Orthodox Christian neighbors, just as they're doing in Ukraine. They love sending brother against brother, and in this case, Georgians are very much related to Russia, and they're very much tied, essentially, not just religiously, according to the Orthodox Church, but also culturally speaking. Georgia was always very close to Russia, historically speaking. So I think Irakli Kobahidze has his work essentially cut out for him. It's very crucial, what takes place in Georgia over the next coming months, and I would say even years.
I totally agree. And I think Lukashenko said it best. He said, Georgian men have been looking at women since they were babies. The Georgian were the coolest men in the Soviet Union. How can some kind of LGBT be imposed on them then? And I think, that's a good point. At the end of the day, what's really prevented the Georgians from caving fully to the EU and the cuck homo agenda is just their sheer and pure homophobia, which is held up by nothing more than the Holy Spirit. So them maintaining, this rejection of just this obvious Jewish propaganda of this child LGBT nonsense has allowed them to buy enough time for the Georgian Dream Party to recoup and for Russia to, kind of bring Georgia back into its sphere of influence as it rightly should be as a Orthodox country that borders Russia. So that's very appropriate. But speaking of, contested elections, again, this is the last show you'll hear before Tuesday, before November 5th, before the big 2024 election, as they say, the quote unquote most important election of our time. And that means that by, I don't really know. In theory, it should be by the next morning. We should know who the president-elect will be, but there's already rumors in multiple states that they're going to take months to count all of these ballots, which is ridiculous. And they say that after 5 days, both transition teams will have to start. So in theory, they say there could be dueling transitions, that the Kamala and the Trump transition teams could be ongoing. But people want to know, Conrad, Dimitri, what do you guys think is going to happen in the election? What's your prediction? So this is the official World War Now election prediction right before the election. So again, anything could happen. I'm not necessarily saying you should hold my feet to the fire on this, but this is what I truly think is going to happen. But I think at this point, nothing would surprise me at this point because people are talking about martial law, this kind of stuff. I think, I do really think Trump is going to win, but I think maybe they assassinate him. There's all sorts of possibilities. But my prediction, I think Trump wins. I actually do, if I had to say my most strong feeling, I think he's going to win it to where they don't need to drag the count out super long. And I think he's going to win, and it's going to even be a larger victory than 2016. And as far as which states, I think he takes everything that he took pretty much in 2016. I think it's a 50-50 on Michigan. So really like a true toss-up on Michigan. I have no idea where that's going to go. I think he also picks up Nevada. And then I also think it's probably a 60-40, 60 in favor of the Democrats, 40 for the Republicans on Virginia, which is crazy. If that were to flip, that would be immense. And if that were to happen, obviously Michigan would have flipped as well. So there's a chance for a very historic win. I think the more likely win is pretty much a moderately increased win from 2016. There's also the possibility that he wins everything from 2016 minus Michigan, which again, that would be less of a victory, but it would still be fairly substantial. So that is my prediction. That's exactly what I think is probably going to happen on November. Things could get crazy. I don't know if they're going to have anything big planned or if anything big is going to happen overseas that's so dramatic that, everybody in the US has to grapple with it. I have, already voted. I wasn't that excited to do it, but I did. And I'm here in Texas. And so Trump's going to take these points. It's not that up for grabs, but I want to know your thoughts, Dimitri. Who is going to win? Does Kamala have this one? Is Trump going to sweep it? Some people are thinking Trump's going to take New Mexico, Virginia, New Jersey. Some people are calling New York a swing state. I mean, people are saying some pretty crazy stuff. I think New York is not a swing state, spoiler alert, but I want to know your thoughts.
I know we Orthodox Christians are not meant to sort of pay attention to dreams, but I did have a dream like less than a week ago of Kamala literally winning the election and, sort of all this strife on social media kind of occurring. And, I think realistically speaking, this is the reason why we don't even believe or pay attention to dreams is because, look, Kamala Harris, I think, despite the fact that, she does have a lot of backing, we see all of Hollywood supporting her, all of the so-called leftist celebrities, of course, coming out on her support. It's really a choice between Donald Trump or somebody who's literally in support of the current status quo. And the current status quo, the Biden presidency, is literally an escalation in Ukraine, an escalation in Israel, allowing Israel to genocide the Palestinians. I think you were correct, Conrad, in voting for Donald J. Trump. I think really the choice here, yes, it is between, say, a lesser and a greater Satan. I think the choice here really is who has the longest horns. And I think Kamala, in this particular case, given her husband, given what we have seen disastrously over the last 3.5, 4 years, I think it's been very clear that if there is any hope at all left on the table, it's that potentially Donald J. Trump could bring around certain people, even maybe like a J.D. Vance. People have been speaking very hopefully in favor of him, or maybe other people in his administration who could, again, improve the situation for Americans domestically, or maybe even in a foreign policy aspect. I think the vote is clearly, I think we have to endorse Trump somewhat. Again, keeping in mind he is a very strong Zionist, and given the fact that he may actually make the situation in the Middle East worse, but his open support for a sort of peaceful ending of the Russo-Ukrainian war, I think is really definitely a positive statement going forward. Although, despite the fact that I do think Donald Trump will win, Conrad, I'm very skeptical of exactly how the election may go, how fair it will be. We have seen, again, the previous election. I was very strongly, in fact, I was so strongly for Trump. I think I even fell asleep on the election night, and I had completely all hope that Trump would defeat Joe Biden. And again, I woke up the next day and it was very clear that the election was either stolen or there was some sort of machination taking place. So I'm not sure if the globalists would, and if the deep state would place their chips and bet on the fact that, well, maybe we can disrupt the domestic situation in the United States enough to actually force Kamala to win. I think given the domination of Elon Musk on X, can you imagine the fact that if Donald Trump loses, Conrad, the amount of drama that will essentially be promoted on X without any suppression of free speech, it'll be so crazy. I think, I'm not sure if the globalists at the moment, given as to what's happening in the Middle East and Europe, want a destabilized America. I think they want an America that is easily controlled, easily swayed. Donald Trump, I think, could be that particular figure who could point the majority of the American citizens' attentions onto the key points that he wants to promote. For example, Israeli dominance in the Middle East, or even a suppression of Russia in Europe, or perhaps a promotion of a transitionary Ukraine to a more peaceful sort of state, and to give less support to Ukraine, maybe more to Israel. I think Donald Trump could be that figure that the globalists are betting on. I do not think a destabilized United States would play into the globalists' hands at the moment. So my guess is Donald Trump will win, especially given all the recent interviews, the promotion of him, and the fact that just Hollywood's sway over, say, world affairs and just the promotion of alternative media generally has been lessening over the past, I would say, decade at least. So my bet is, again, on Donald J. Trump. But in the end, I think it's anybody's game, unfortunately, because the last election, I thought exactly the same thing. And in fact, it didn't go according to my prediction and guess.
Yeah, we all remember what happened on 2020. I was in Idaho and, it was 4, 5, 6 a.m. We were spinning the block, my friends and I, smoking cigs, like, what is happening? Like, what is going on? But it was, I have a feeling that Trump will be able to have decisive enough victory to perhaps prevent any cheating from, dragging this thing out for months. We have no idea. We're seeing, I think it was in Washington and Oregon, we saw ballot drop boxes lit on fire, and people are trying to say this is evidence that there's going to be some crazy machinations and everything. I don't know exactly. The Pacific Northwest is the most, you could say, politically radical region of the United States as far as far left and far right people like clashing. So there's always going to be kind of weird dramatic stuff there. That's where all the Chaz stuff happened. That's where the biggest Proud Boys versus Antifa brawls have always happened. I mean, Ruby Ridge also was in, northern Idaho. So all these things are kind of all adjacent to each other there. So that might explain that. But they are obviously, certain powers that be have said that, ballot counting could take extended periods of time. They have released all the protocol for the dueling transitions, all these kinds of things. So it's going to be a wild night. I don't know what we'll do. Maybe I'll go live. I don't know. I have no idea. Maybe it'd be stupid to not capitalize on the views, but I think I might do something with my friends or something. Who knows? But it's going to be exciting to say the least, because I think the most exciting thing is going to be there could be immediate geopolitical consequences, because I think if Trump is announced a winner, certain things I think in Ukraine would start to escalate I don't think they would even need to wait until his inauguration to start changing the game there, considering how much it's been put on the back burner even by our current State Department and White House. But the real issue is with the Israelis. I think as much as they would like to, I think they're probably going to have to wait for the inauguration to actually do anything if Trump is to win, because if Trump is to win and they know that it's over for Biden and Kamala, Biden personally, I know he literally despises Netanyahu. So if Biden's in there for a few more months as a lame duck, he's going to do everything he can to sabotage the Israeli effort and try to just do as much rapprochement with Iran as he can. So I think the Israelis would still have to play ball with him until Trump was inaugurated. But, it's very interesting, and I think things could go all sorts of different ways. I think the next 2 weeks after the election in specifically China, Taiwan, Russia, Ukraine, and then the Levant, it's going to be very interesting. Probably more interesting even than the election or whatever fallout people are complaining about in the streets about ballots and, mail-ins and voting machines and, hacking and this, that, or the other. I'm a bit more interested in the World War III fallout. But unless you have anything else to say about the election and your thoughts, Dimitri, and maybe before we get to the church persecution, which is kind of how we always end the show, do you have any other fronts on World War III you want to update us on? I know Japan had their election where the ruling center-right party have pretty much, they got their worst results recently, and, they're going to have to basically rely on the far right and these libertarians to form a coalition. We know that right now in Bolivia, there's a coup ongoing. Evo Morales, former head of Bolivia, he is leading this coup, and, they're trying to negotiate. He's claiming he's going to go on a hunger strike. His supporters are taking army officers and army soldiers prisoner. this is what's ongoing. I'm not that versed on Bolivian politics, I know, but it is generally aligned a lot of ways with the multipolar sphere. It's one of these, I hate to say it, kind of communist shitholes that, that all these third worldist internationals, people really, Jackson Hinkle, I'm sure he loves Bolivia and loves Evo Morales. So you can listen to him if you want to get the take on that. But as far as anything else goes, I know Vietnam and China are clashing a bit in the South China Sea. And of course, the Ethiopia, Somaliland, Israel deal is continuing. Ethiopia recently said in a meeting with Lukashenko, actually, Abiy Ahmed, he said this in a meeting with Belarusian officials, that Ethiopia will make it to the Red Sea very soon. I think even next year is what they were saying. So it seems they're committed to the Somaliland deal. And if somehow that falls through, I don't know, that means war with Eritrea or something like that. So the Ethiopians are all in, and maybe the Israelis are going to help them on that because Israel seems willing to recognize Somaliland to get another base. So I don't know what Egypt and Somalia and Sudan and Eritrea are going to do to stop this, but I guess we'll see.
Yeah, I think people don't appreciate the fact that Ethiopia and even Ethiopian Oriental Christianity is very Judaized in certain aspects. Like, they do respect that Old Testament lineage. They have all kinds of legends going back to King Solomon's times, whether or not these are more or less fairy tale-esque, whether or not there is some real lineage to that Old Testament, of course, connection there, right, between Ethiopians. For example, they don't eat pork. They've translated some of the Old Testament laws over into their new sort of near church behavior, I think. And culturally speaking, we do see circumcision being very popular among certain groups of the Ethiopian Christian population, as well as other very interesting, shall we say, Judaized aspects. But I don't think their theology is developed enough to even focus on issues, for example, that surrounding books such as the Talmud, the Shulchan Aruch, and other texts that the Talmudic Jews have developed since the 400s, 500s AD, which again go directly against Christianity. So my hope is that if Israel does really position itself as an ally of Ethiopia against its Muslim neighbors, that the Ethiopians realize that even if they ally themselves temporarily with Israel in order to access the Red Sea, that this relationship really cannot be sort of long-term, and eventually Israel most likely strike out against its Ethiopian Christian allies in the future, because we do know what Israel's attitude really is like towards Christians, I think, generally speaking. And Ethiopian migrants and pilgrims were bullied before in Israel. So this is kind of a long story, but I think those in Ethiopia, who I know a lot of them follow my Twitter account, particularly the World War Now Twitter X account, and we do have a lot of Ethiopian followers and maybe even listeners on the show that should consider the fact that Israel is not a friend of the Christians. I think this is a very sort of important message, which is missed a lot of the time because of these specific differences in Ethiopian culture as opposed to the rest of the Christian world. Regarding the Japanese election, I think really curious. The Liberal Democratic Party, which is the sort of status quo Japanese majority party, has lost 68 seats in the parliament. So they've lost the majority. This is very crucial because, again, the Liberal Democratic Party, if we can even, they are center-right more or less, but center-right as in they're still pro-American, very much pro-liberal, Conrad. And the party that's actually gained 52 seats is the Constitutional Democratic Party of Japan. They're the second largest party. They're very liberal, even more LGBTQ aligned, pro-gay marriage Japanese. They're willing to push Japan into a sort of, shall we say, a realm of development, which really I think the Japanese people shouldn't go down, because again, Japan in and of itself is already facing a lot of cultural trauma from its sort of Americanization and liberalization since the time of World War II. But the Constitutional Democratic Party is willing to escalate that, essentially probably destroying the Japanese people as a whole, as a very sort of sensitive and small, delicate ethnic group and culture. And as you mentioned, the only hope the Liberal Democratic Party has is, again, allying itself with the Ishin Party. And the Ishin Party, I think it's called the Japanese Innovation Party. It's a very right-wing conservative Japanese party, which is very, I wouldn't say they're anti-American, but they are the most right-wing, militaristic. They're willing to, one of their key positions, right, which I think if they ever form a majority in Japan, this will be a really strong change of position in Japanese politics. They're willing to remove the threshold that is currently in place on Japanese defense spending, essentially the Japanese military. And we know Japan has an incredible infrastructural sort of basis. In fact, they're willing to reduce the sort of threshold that's currently placed on Japanese defense spending to allow Japan to spend more on its navy, on its military, essentially to rebuild what was lost, I suppose, since the time of the World War II, which is essentially Japanese military sovereignty, which was completely given up. And we know Japan has 40 plus American bases on its territory. It's essentially a country under the yoke of the American hegemon. And, I'm sure Americans have their own position, given the fact that Japan did bomb Pearl Harbor and it did actually wage war against the American people. I'm sure there are American patriotic positions which are somewhat in favor of keeping Japan under this sort of controlled state, even maybe patriotic Christian American positions that, well, Japan shouldn't really have an independent military. But I think, generally speaking, if we look out into the future, the American military industrial complex, Conrad, has been using Japan, utilizing it as essentially as a weapon and as an instrument against any anti-American sentiments in the Western Pacific, specifically against China. And again, when we speak about the escalation into a hot World War III, it's very much, unfortunately for the Japanese people, if they remain under this American hegemony, we'll see their use. America will utilize them against their own interests, against the stronger anti-American neighbors, for example, China, North Korea, and potentially even Russia with the Kuriliski Ostrova, the Kuril Islands, right, which Japan really wants to take control of. And if we even think about, for example, the Sakhalin Peninsula, which Japan held for a few years after the Russo-Japanese War, there are some real concerns about the Japanese people being used as pawns. So the hope is that over the next few years, perhaps the Japanese people will regain their sovereignty. But at the moment, as we can see, the Liberal Democratic Party, the Constitutional Democratic Party, the status quo is still there. The liberals, the pro-American group in Japan is still very strongly in control. And that's not going to change regardless of who wins the American election. And I think the Japanese people are very much in the pro-globalist camp. And as World War III kind of develops and moves along, I don't think we'll see a change in this, unfortunately. So this election, somewhat consequential, given the fact that, in like a bad way, given the fact that the liberals and the leftists in Japan are winning even more seats. And I think this really speaks to, if you compare this to Georgia, in that most of these countries are really taking strong positions. It's like you're either very, very progressive and leftist, or you're in fact trying to stop your country from going down this slippery slope into complete degeneracy. Unfortunately, Japan, I think, has gotten on the water slide and it's sliding further down into the Enlightenment sort of postmodernist abyss, whereas Georgia is trying to hold on for its dear life. And I think that's the kind of difference we see between these two recent parliamentary elections around the world.
I think that's a good analysis and a good comparison. Japan, they are very much aligned, obviously, with the globalist empire. They're like the main force sort of in the anti-China front. They're kind of sitting there, obviously. The historic big beef has been between Japan and China. They're the largest populations. They lost the most people fighting each other in the world wars. And I think Japan, though, despite the fact that they are so occupied by the US and that they are very neoliberal in certain aspects, they have a very, very large pro-Palestine base. Like the average Japanese person is probably more likely to be pro-Palestine than pro-Israel. And that's because Jewish society was never quite as successful as infiltrating Japan as it has been in Western European society. And that's, of course, because, East Asians were never a threat to quote unquote world Jewry as much because they never had established large population centers there. And I think the fact that you see so many pro-Palestine protests in Japan, that's why you saw some victories with some of these small far left parties in Japan that are very pro-Palestine. Unfortunately, a large amount of those representatives are extremely pro-homosexual, butt sex and gay marriage and stuff like that. So It's not the reality that we want to see, but we've covered a lot on this show. I think we've covered all the bases. Unless there's anything else that you have to cover before we hit persecutions, we probably got to talk about what happened to Metropolitan Longin in Ukraine.
Yes, really unfortunate news. Metropolitan Longin was taken to court again. During his particular hearing, the judge made some very provocative and direct statements, I think inappropriately directed at the defendant, Metropolitan Longin in particular. And he was just sitting there and suddenly he felt bad, he felt ill, and he was taken to hospital urgently straight out of the court hearing room. The hearing was adjourned, and Metropolitan Longin, again, he suffered from perhaps a heart attack. We're not too sure at the moment, but he is ill. He is in reanimation at the Western Ukrainian hospital. Again, a lot of these hierarchs who've been encountering persecution by the authorities in Ukraine, whether it's military or civil authorities, they've again suffered from extremely deteriorating health, whether or not it's poisoning or it's just the psychological pressure on the Metropolitan Longin. Of course, he's been beaten, harassed. His children have been lynched, kidnapped. I mean, it's the list of offenses against some of these hierarchs is so long. I mean, we've been covering it on the show for more than a year now, at least. And now that the persecution is really heating up, I think he'll be one of the first, shall we say, new martyrs of the Russo-Ukrainian war. And the list has already been expanding. There are quite a few, again, I would say confessors, people who've suffered under the Ukrainian, shall we say, the Judeo-Ukrainian yoke. And I think he may be one of the first bishops who actually, unfortunately, will be martyred for this particular cause. And this is in very large contrast to what we see recently, the general position of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Now that persecution has been openly announced by the Ukrainian state and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church has been made illegal, and the persecution has been, now that what we saw take place in Cherkasy has been quite openly pronounced in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, the Synod has passed a very strong statement against the Russian Orthodox Church. So in fact, we see some of the chief Ukrainian hierarchs not really focusing on the persecution, not focusing on Metropolitan Arseny or Metropolitan Theodosius or Metropolitan Longin. They're focusing on the Russo-Ukrainian war and the sort of issues surrounding some of the SMO dioceses. In particular, we mentioned the Diocese of Donetsk, so the long-suffering city of Donetsk. Its Metropolitan Hilarion was replaced last week by the Russian Orthodox Church. In particular, the Russian Synod in Moscow and Patriarch Kirill specifically requested that Metropolitan Hilarion of Donetsk is retired and that he goes to stay and live in Crimea in sort of retirement, I suppose. And the new Metropolitan of Donetsk is announced to be Metropolitan Vladimir, traveling from all the way in the Far East, right next to North Korea, of course, from Vladivostok. But what's interesting is the Ukrainian Orthodox Church has openly signed a collective letter to the Russian Orthodox Church accusing Patriarch Kirill and the Russian Synod of breaching certain canons, going against the church canonical order, and essentially going against the stance of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. They're accusing the Russian Church of essentially appointing a bishop without asking Kiev, without asking the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. This letter was signed by 33 metropolitans and bishops and archbishops of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. We see some very key names here. Of course, Metropolitan Onufry being at the head, Metropolitan Agafangel of Odessa and Ismail, Metropolitan Agafangel in particular. He's very key because he is one of the most anti-Russian, pro-Ukrainian canonical bishops in Ukraine at the moment. And he's also the oldest bishop of Russia and Ukraine, I think, generally speaking. I think he's 86 or 87 years of age. He's been a bishop since 1991, so he's quite had like a long tenureship as a metropolitan, as a bishop, one of the more experienced bishops. And also Odessa is given it's a port city, it's one of the largest cities in all of Ukraine. It's one of the richest dioceses. So again, very influential bishop. He signed a letter. Unfortunately, Metropolitan Yevlogy of the Sumskaya Oblast, whose diocese has literally been personally under the persecution of Zelensky's Zionist government, he's also signed this letter. We notice Metropolitan, of course, Arseny being in prison, Metropolitan Theodosius of Cherkasy, and Metropolitan Longin, who's now in hospital, have not signed this letter. So given the fact that Ukraine only has 90 bishops, 33 of them, exactly a third, have signed this letter, it's very clear that a large portion of Ukrainian bishops are still hoping that potentially Zelensky and the Ukrainian parliament will change their position if they proclaim themselves as pro-Ukrainian. Potentially they're hoping for an end for the persecution from the West. Maybe the West will have mercy on the Orthodox Christians in Ukraine. And I don't think they have any hope of Russia liberating some of these central Ukrainian and West Ukrainian dioceses. Like we speak a lot about this, Conrad, where, well, if Russia again progresses through Ukraine and liberates some of these other oblasts and dioceses, perhaps the persecution will end there. This is not the position of at least 33% of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. A lot of them have lost hope in a sort of Russian liberation, and they're actually betting on the fact that maybe Zelensky will change his position and maybe he'll stop promoting the schism. Maybe he'll turn his back on this Western-aligned idea of destroying Orthodoxy. And I think that's a very dangerous gambit. But again, what do you do in such a complex situation? We can only kind of observe this. The only thing that would really change this particular drama taking place between the Russian and Ukrainian church at the moment is if the former Metropolitan of Donetsk, who's currently in retirement, Metropolitan Hilarion, officially releases a letter or a statement stating that he agrees with his own removal and he's happy that the Russian Orthodox Church now that Donetsk is a part of the Russian Federation, that this particular diocese, he's happy with his own replacement. Because at the moment, he's remained silent. It almost seems as if Patriarch Kirill forcefully sent him into retirement and essentially replaced the Metropolitan Vladimir. So this kind of ecclesiological drama is currently unraveling in Ukraine at the same time as the persecution is taking place. So incredibly complex situation. A really bizarre story that one of the most popular deacons in all of Ukraine, probably the most popular deacon, we call him the TikTok deacon. This is Archdeacon Andrei Palchuk. He creates TikToks, Instagram Reels, all kinds of short-form videos on YouTube as well, promoting the Ukrainian armed forces. He's from the Odessa diocese. His metropolitan is Agafangel, who I mentioned is incredibly anti-Russian. And he's openly stated that he now supports Fauda, essentially a Ukrainian drone group, an Ukrainian battle drone group. He's received a medal and a certificate from this drone group because he's promoted fundraising for them, essentially promoting the Ukrainian armed forces. We've noted that this Fauda Ukrainian drone group is led by a former IDF Israeli sniper named Sergei Gromov. And Fauda in Hebrew means chaos, in particular chaos when it relates to the enemies of Israel. So Archdeacon Andrei is openly supporting essentially a Zionist Ukrainian drone group named Chaos, and he's been congratulated by them. Thank you, Archdeacon Andrei, for supporting this Ukro-Zionistic Talmudic drone group, which is again part of the larger Ukrainian battalion Achilles, which is responsible for sending a lot of these drones to attack the Russian forces in the Kursk Oblast in particular. So when we see these drones hitting Orthodox Christian churches, attacking villages, innocent civilians in Kursk, in Bryansk, in Belgorod, we need to remember it's sometimes these aren't Ukrainian pilots piloting the drones. It's literally former IDF veterans, essentially Israeli people like Sergei Gromov, literally Zionists. And some of the drone groups are literally named after Hebrew words such as chaos, right? There's even I believe, Israeli TV show called Fauda, which is really curious. So again, some archdeacons in Ukraine, specifically Father Andrei, has made some serious mistakes. It looks ridiculous, again, Orthodox Christian deacon supporting an Israeli Zionist attack force. The other unfortunate news is that we have Steven Seagal creating a documentary. And in the documentary is called In the Name of Justice. This is, remember, Steven Seagal, that former Hollywood actor who traveled to Russia. He then met with, of course, he stopped in Romania, met with Andrew Tate. Then he went to Russia. He hasn't converted to Orthodoxy. I think he became a Buddhist, but he's currently stationed in Moscow, just hanging out there, meeting with like Jackson Hinkle and some of the other characters. He created a documentary about Donetsk. And the unfortunate story in one of his documentaries was that there were actually Ukrainian forces torturing Russian Orthodox clergymen. In particular, there's a story of hieromonk Feofan. He's a priest monk located in Mariupol. And when the Azov Battalion and other Ukrainian special forces were controlling Mariupol since, I believe, at the beginning of the SMO in February of 2022, they actually took hieromonk Feofan, began waterboarding him, torturing him in one of the Mariupol basements. And this particular story is very vividly explained in Steven Seagal's documentary. And again, this just paints another image that Russian POWs, whether it's clergymen, laity, are mistreated very heavily. And I need to emphasize this, Conrad. A lot of people are stating, well, this POW exchange is taking place. This is inappropriate. I think Russian POWs really need to be rescued from Ukrainian war prisons, in particular, because we have some very horrifying statistics. In particular, Yuri Yevich, as I mentioned, one of the top Russian medics, has clearly stated that more than half, or he stated half, but I'm sure that the number's probably slightly less. Maybe he's exaggerated it slightly. He stated that close to half of all Russian POWs who return from Ukrainian prisons end up committing suicide due to the psychological damage which they experience through Ukrainian interrogations and torture. In particular, Ukrainians are known for physically abusing their victims, for example, cutting up or mutilating some of their body parts, in particular, those related to sexual functions, shall we say. And then the Russian forces, the soldiers returning from these prisons, are then in deep depression. They're not able to form any families, if you know what I'm saying, not able to have children, and then they end up committing suicide out of pure depression. And apparently this has been taking place over the last 2 years. So again, this is really scary stuff, the Ukrainian prisons. In fact, the Russian forces in the Kursk Oblast, they're actually straight up telling their troops not to ever surrender to Ukrainians, not to ever be taken alive by them because of the known abuse that the Russians experience in Ukrainian prisons. And this is quite horrifying. It really does promote a sort of last stand psychological stance amongst the Russian troops. And for those Russian troops not equipped to face death, it really does cause a lot of psychological damage. So really horrifying stuff from the front lines. This war has been horrific, I think, for everyone involved. And given the recent persecution escalation, Conrad, it's really not surprising that the globalists are pouring so many funds into this conflict, promoting it, firing it up, using it as sort of their battering ram against all Christians in the world, in particular the Orthodox Christian Church, because it is producing such outstanding results for them in terms of destroying orthodoxy and also killing Orthodox Christians, torturing them, and even psychologically, mentally damaging them to the extent where, well, apparently a lot of Russian POWs are, former POWs are committing suicide. I mean, horrific news. But nevertheless, these recent progresses on the front lines by the Russian forces, maybe even the presence of North Korean troops, it does give us a sort of glimmer of hope. Perhaps Ukraine will be forced into making some very serious concessions in the near future. And maybe the US election in the next coming few days will maybe also benefit a sort of peaceful end to what exactly is taking place at the moment, which is very difficult to cover, I think, without becoming too passionate or too emotionally invested.
I very much agree, and that was ultimately the main motivating factor for voting for Trump, is that was the most likely scenario that leads to the end of the persecution of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. So seemed like a simple enough decision to me. But lest we end on a depressing note, we have a new saint. This is from Ortho Christian. The glorification of a new martyr of the Russian Orthodox Church from Vyatka was celebrated on Wednesday, October 30th. At its session in late July, the Holy Synod of the Russian Orthodox Church resolved to canonize higher martyr Alexei Lopatin, who was martyred by the godless authorities in 1918. He was also included in the Synaxis of the Saints of Vyatka, which was celebrated on Wednesday. The service at the Cathedral of St. Catherine of Slobodskoy in Kirov Province included the glorification of St. Alexei, was led by His Eminence Metropolitan Mark of Vyatka. Before communion, Archpriest Andrei Lebedev offered a homily about the day's festivities. He recounted how St. Alexei served until his martyrdom in 1918, when he was executed for defending the church during persecutions. He explained how the nuns of Pixar Monastery later documented St. Alexei's life story leading to his canonization. Finally, he urged the congregation to celebrate with paschal joy and bring their families back to the church, remembering those who preserved the faith in difficult times. So we have a new saint in the church, Saint Alexei Lopatin. So people can read, there's a hagiography of him on Ortho Christian as well if people want to read that, but that's joyous. It's always good to celebrate the new saints of the church, and the Russian new martyrs are, the more new martyrs there are, the more prayers we have for, for the resurrection of Russia and for the return of the empire and the Orthodox catechon and these sorts of things. So continue to, keep that in your prayers and, ask these saints for their intercessions, including the new Saint Alexei. But with all of that being said, it's about time to wrap things up. It's been a great show, a lot of different news to cover in World War III. And of course, a lot of things are on the precipice. In the next show, we will be discussing the fallout from this upcoming election and all of the geopolitics and, where World War III will go now that everybody has the information that we're all waiting to learn. So stay tuned for all of that. Obviously, worldwarnow.co. That's where you can find everything. That's where you can get behind the paywall and listen to every episode of Ether Hour and support the show. It is not very expensive, just $7 a month. You can pay less if you get by the year and all of these sorts of things. So again, we also have our Q&A threads, which are next Ether Hour. I think we might have one more, and then we're going to have a Q&A. So we're going to be answering your questions that you can answer in the chat. In the future, the Q&As are going to be in chat threads. So be prepared for that. I'm going to try to get it to where those can be sent out in emails. But to keep up with us elsewhere, be sure to follow us on X, WorldWarNow_. Follow me on X at GnomeRad, like a garden gnome. So GNOME rad_. That's my username. Follow Dimitri at OCanonist. Be sure to follow us on Telegram, World War Now Telly, and of course, subscribe to the YouTube channel, World War Now. We do live streams there. You can find us on Rumble as well. But again, the Substack is our home base, worldwarnow.co, worldwarnow.substack.com also works. Download the Substack app and add us on there. Subscribe again, get behind that paywall. That is how the show keeps functioning and keeps going. So thank you so much to those of you that are behind the paywall and are paid subscribers. It means the world to us. So stay tuned for future shows. Keep everything in your prayers. Keep the country in your prayers. It's just democracy. It's fake and gay anyway. So, things aren't going to get so bad. Everyone's going to survive. So just keep everything in your prayers. God ultimately is in control, and we know who wins in the end. So, that's how things go. Again, thank you so much for listening, everybody, and God bless. We'll see you on the next one.